So today I'm going to talk about the proper role of government. And by government, I'm referring to a Republican form of government because there's a lot of misnomers. People are conflating a Republican form of government with democracy, and we need to clear all those things up. But before I even get to that, I want to address some comments, or I'm not sure. Well, anyway, somebody came to my comment section to troll. I think he was a subscriber, or he just came for that one video. He subscribed and then he unsubscribed immediately, um, stating some ignorant things. And I thought that I made a mistake by addressing the last topic, which was what are rights, or I forget what I titled it, but I originally thought that I should address what is the role of government first, but I think that was a mistake because, or I think I did it the right way because now I get an opportunity to address the questions because I guess people weren't there during a live stream, so they didn't get to ask me those questions, and now I get an opportunity to clarify. So let's go ahead and pull up this comment. I want to put it on full screen. Okay. This channel is really an excellent place for smart people to come together. I appreciate your efforts at communicating these various topics. Thank you. Well, I appreciate it. I'm learning myself, and these questions actually challenge me because there are things that I may not think about, and then I have to go and research it, and then I'm just like, okay, well, now that I know something, now when someone else challenges me, I can provide an appropriate answer. So I can see. Let me pull it, make it a large screen. Okay. So hopefully y'all can see it. Um, this person says this is foolish. There are no natural rights. Nature is completely nihilistic. It's survival of the strongest and most adaptable in nature, which includes any type of harmful person. Anarchy is for clowns. I don't have a problem with any type of pushback, right? You can say whatever you want. You can disagree with me, but you're making a claim and then you're using an ad hominem attack, which fine, I use ad hominem attacks. I use invective, but usually it's in response to someone attacking me or someone making non sequiturs or something like that. It's not, I lead with an argument first, and then if they respond with something nonsensical, then I make ad hominem attack. So his his leading response was an ad hominem, which means he doesn't have an argument. And so this person, I'm assuming he unsubscribed. So um this channel is for intellectuals. So you're not welcome on my channel at this point. Um and it's not just because you disagree with me, it's just because you lab with me. You lab it with calling me a clown. Um if you wanted to make a response, if you want to disagree with me, that's fine. And if I didn't answer your question, then you can call me a clown, but you didn't even give me an opportunity. So don't come back to my channel. You're not welcome. Before I was pandering, I wanted to get as many subscribers as possible. Now I don't really give a fuck. I want my channel to be exclusive for the intellectuals, those who care about liberty and freedom, those who care about the future of the human species. So I'm going to address this. There are no natural rights. While it is true that rights are a social construct, it doesn't mean that they don't exist. And I'm going to explain why or how John Locke derived at natural rights. Because there's this notion that rights that might makes right, and so therefore there can be no rights. Um, the source of natural rights can be philosophy, religion, or a social contract. And so although they originally concocted natural rights based on uh, or deriving from God, that's not, it doesn't necessarily have to come from God, right? Because what John Locke said is that in a state of nature, right? In a state of nature, y'all are looking at it as just without government. No, it's not just without government. It's a total state of nature, which is if you were born on a deserted island, it was just you and nature. What rights would you have, right? If there was no one to infringe on your rights, no one to try to subjugate you, what rights would you have? You would have the right to life, liberty, and property. You would have to fend for your own survival. You would have to go hunt. You would have to build your own shelter. You would be free to do whatever you wanted, and there would be no one to stop you from doing that. So that is the state of nature. I'm not sure what I did a video about that, or yeah, about what the state of nature is, and that was from the perspective of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Um, I don't think that Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Locke disagree on what the state of nature is. That is the state of nature. So that is where your natural rights come from. If you were born without any interference from anyone else, without interference from private citizens or the government, those would be your rights. So you can disagree with me on that. I don't know what your disagreement would be, but it's not like they just pulled this out of thin air. What they're saying is that natural rights are inherent. They're intrinsic based on the nature of a human being. It's not saying that it comes from nature, right? You didn't even give me an opportunity to explain what it is. It's not, it doesn't come from nature, nor, okay, what is the second part? Survival of the strongest and most adaptable in nature, right? That is what see, that's not even the state of nature, because the state of nature, the strongest survive, but that is really the state of society. That's when you're competing for resources. That's when you have a government oppressing you. That's when you're competing for resources. That's not the state of nature. So I'm sorry that you didn't read up on natural law, but it's not my fault. That's your ignorance. I'm here to save you from your ignorance because you don't know what you're talking about. And then I'm trying to see if I can go back up. Okay. There was another one that he, okay. Okay, here was the other one. If nature had real rights, it would be enforcing them. A more coherent natural right is that one has the highest right, not spontaneously to not spontaneously combust. That's real natural law. Your proposed list of natural rights are nothing but desires of your brain, nothing more. Scientific fact. Scientific fact. There's no science. I mean, where's your source for that? And I'm admitting that rights are a social construct. I'm admitting that. It's not, but it still is based on logic. It's not something that is arbitrary. It's based on something that can be verified. In a state of nature, you can observe lions in a state of okay, so this let me address what he said. He said if nature had real rights, it would be enforced. First of all, nature doesn't have rights, human beings have rights. So you got that part wrong. And it's not the government's role. Well, it is the government's role to protect your rights. That is the function of government. So if you don't believe in natural rights, then that is the purpose of government. So you're saying that I'm a clown for promoting anarchy, but if you don't believe that the government is protecting your rights, then the result would be to eliminate government. That's what John Locke said. If the government does not live up to its duty to protect your rights, then it is your right to overthrow government. So if you don't believe that we have rights, then what is the purpose of government? That is the only purpose of government, is to protect your rights. I just don't understand. Like what you're saying makes no sense. You don't know the first thing about what a Republican form of government is. You don't know anything about natural law. And instead of asking questions, you want to come in here and attack. You're anti-progress. You're a status slave, and you're a danger to society. You're trying to enslave us by saying that we don't have rights. If you don't have rights, then you don't know what you're supposed to be defending. You can't recognize tyranny if you don't know what is right and what is wrong. So we don't have rights. We're just supposed to be slaves. You're saying that first of all, everyone is complaining already that the government is oppressive, that the government is not following the Constitution. But what they're doing is they're saying, oh, it's the Democrats, oh, it's the Republican. No, it's both parties. And the belief that there is an actual two-party system that they're competing is a misnomer. They are one and the same. They represent the same interests. They pretend to be on opposite sides of the fence, but they are both here to take away your rights, to mass more power for themselves and to control us, because they don't think that we're smart enough or competent enough to control our own lives. So you are a status slave and you are a threat to my liberty. I want you as far away from me as possible. You can be a slave if you want, but you don't have a right to enslave me. Yes, I'm going to promote anarchy because that is what John Locke said. John Locke said if the government is not protecting our rights, we have the right to overthrow it. And the government is not protecting our rights. The government destroyed my life, made my life a living hell. And before experiences in real time, I was a status slave just like you. Now I'm here to save you from your ignorance. If you don't want to be saved, you can continue being a fucking slave, but you're just not going to promote slavery on my channel. All right, so that was my rant. Let's go back to StreamYard. See if I have any comments. Would you say that natural laws apply to animals equally in the state of nature? The animals are entitled to build their shelters and have whatever freedoms they can obtain via their intelligence. As I stated before, I don't believe that okay. I'm going to be intellectually honest because I don't want to sound like I'm biased. In theory, they can have natural rights, but that is what the state of nature is. So the question becomes, who is obligated to protect those rights? And so we have a social contract where you're not left out in the wild to protect your own rights. So we gave the government the role of protecting our rights. But if the government isn't living up to that, we have a social contract. So when they breach that contract, then we can overthrow the government. And so the animals don't have the capacity to make a social contract. So therefore, I mean, of course, they have the right to defend their own rights. Like a lion can attack you, or a horse can kick you, but it's not a social contract. So there is not enforceable through, well, beyond their own means of defense. Nature has its own means of defending themselves. Animals can defend themselves through physical force. And also, I mean, so this applies not just to animals, this applies to plants too. Plants have a natural right to exist, just like animals. And their defense mechanism is to evolve to have anti-nutrients. So when you eat those plants, that is their manner of protecting themselves. So it applies to everything. But again, plants nor animals can engage in a social contract. Okay, so hopefully that clears that up. Oh gosh, we're already 14 minutes in. I haven't even started on the video. All right, so I just converted this video from Ayn Rand. If y'all have any questions, please ask me now, because I don't want people coming in the comment section later asking me. So this is your opportunity. I just lost 2 people, but that's fine. I'm sure they'll be back later. Let's go.
I don't know exactly how to start off on this. I guess it is a rather broad topic, but what would you say is the most valuable political system?
valuable from what standpoint? You really should mean what is the right or the proper political system. Since political systems are man-made and a matter of human choice, the question should be, what is the right political system? Isn't that what you mean?
Yes.
Well, capitalism, of course. Total, uncontrolled, laissez-faire capitalism, which means a separation of state and economics.
Well, when we speak of political systems, we usually think of capitalism as an economic system and a political system such as a republic or a democracy.
Well, that is correct, but capitalism should be really called the political-economic system, because every economic system requires and depends on a certain kind of political structure.
Okay, I'm just going to say this right now. Just because I'm playing her video doesn't mean that I agree that capitalism is the ideal form of government. Yeah, I'm not sure that I agree with that. I do agree, but she does accurately define what a Republican form of government is. So that's the only reason why I'm using her as a reference. But the capitalism stuff, no, I'm not sure that I agree with her.
And the structure appropriate to a capitalist economy is a republic, but a specific kind of republic.
What kind?
The American kind. The republic established in basic principle by the American Constitution.
Okay, so she's saying that capitalism is a type of republic. I don't know that it is, because, and I think she is contradicting herself, because corporations are creations of the state, and then they're given special rights above flesh and blood human beings. So she's not here anymore to explain herself, but I do think that is a contradiction, because she's already said that rights can only belong to human beings. So what right do corporations have to form a separate fictitious entity and be recognized by the state, and then be protected by the state, and in a manner that supersedes what a human being would receive? So yeah, I don't agree with her on the capitalism thing. I think there shouldn't be a such thing as a private corporation. They should either operate as human beings, or they shouldn't exist at all, or they can exist for a public purpose, but they shouldn't exist for a private purpose.
Namely, a system which is devised to limit the power of the government and properly reduces the government to only one function, the only function which a government may morally have, namely the protection of individual rights.
Mr. Gandolfi.
You have often stated.
Okay, I really want to underscore what she just said. That is the core function of government, to protect your individual rights. That is the only function of government, or legitimate form of government. I'm sorry, Republican form of government. Controlling your life, regulating who you can marry, all that shit, whether you can get an abortion, all that shit. No, that is an illegitimate exercise of authority under Republican form of government. Taking your taxes, redistributing wealth, all that shit, illegitimate. That is not. And again, I mean, because somebody said that what I was promoting was libertarianism. Libertarianism is actually a form of anarchy. It's called libertarian anarchy. I'm not very specific about which one I'm promoting. It's just, I want limited government. I would probably support eliminating government completely, but the core function of government is to protect our individual rights. But if it's not doing that, then it should be overthrown.
That a proper government should be limited by a written constitution. In view of what has happened to the U.S. Constitution, do you think that any written document can be effective in limiting government power, no matter how strictly written it is, if there is a determined power trying to enlarge the sphere of government activity?
Well, there are two aspects to your question, really. If you are asking, can a written document automatically guarantee compliance with that document and automatically protect a society from any groups that may want to destroy that document, then the answer, of course, is no. Nothing can automatically establish a perfect system which will work regardless of the philosophical knowledge and understanding of the citizens of that country. And no document will protect a country when and if men do not choose to think, do not choose to understand their actions and to protect the right principles. Therefore, no document is protection against the philosophical status and knowledge of the citizens of a country. But assuming an enlightened electorate or a country with the proper intellectual foundation, a written document is necessary because it limits the power of the government. It is an objective point of reference in case of any doubts as to where the power of the government lies and what type of laws cannot be passed.
Y'all hear that? A Republican form of government is dependent upon having an informed electorate. So if you want to be ignorant and you don't know what your rights are, and you just think the government can do whatever it wants, you're infringing on my rights with your status bullshit because you're in your ignorance. And that is the reason why we're all enslaved. It's your fault. You have to take responsibility. And this is what Noam Chomsky wrote about in his book, Manufactured Consent. They program you to think that this is of your own volition, and they're doing it for the general will of the public, but really they're just trying to control and enslave us. And then we have dumbasses coming in my comment section trying to defend it, and they don't even know what the hell they're talking about, right? Because this person is probably a supporter, a proponent of the two-party system. He's probably thinking, oh, is this the Republicans, is this the Democrats? It's really both of them. So yeah, I don't trust you with the power to control, like coercive power of the vote to decide what should be the manner in which I should live my life. And she's about to explain the difference between a Republican form of government and democracy.
And observe that it's precisely the history of what happened to the American Constitution that proves my point. It proves the necessity of a constitution. Why? Because in order to undermine the Constitution to the extent to which it has been undermined, it was necessary to rely on certain contradictions or vaguenesses in the Constitution. The whole destruction of our political system was done by means of certain clauses, contradictory clauses in the Constitution, the worst of which was the Interstate Commerce Clause. And the right of eminent domain also entered.
Okay, y'all. So, in case y'all don't know, the Supreme Court expanded the scope of the federal government through the Interstate Commerce Clause because they used that as a backdoor to regulate state activity, to say that as long as it has an undue burden on interstate commerce, then Congress can regulate state activity. So that has been a backdoor to give Congress all kinds of unenumerated authority. And one of these examples is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in which Congress ordered integration, right? Because states did not support, many states did not support integration, and then they used the Interstate Commerce Clause to say that segregation had an undue burden on commerce, and then they came in and and sent the National Guard and all that shit. So yeah, that, I mean, if you like the result, then maybe that's not a problem for you, but it becomes a problem later on because now they can use that Interstate Commerce Clause to regulate all kinds of things. And then she talked about eminent domain. Eminent domain is when the government takes private property for a public purpose, and then they're supposed to give you a just compensation. But what often happens is they they are not taking that property for a public purpose. They're taking it for a private purpose, and then you're not even getting just compensation. So they may use eminent domain so that a private corporation can have access to it. Maybe they're trying to build something that runs through your property, and then the government gives them eminent domain, and you don't even get a fair you don't get justly compensated for your land. So that's what she's talking about with eminent domain.
This day, when Congress is passing blatantly unconstitutional laws, you may observe that the Supreme Court is stretching the meaning of the Constitution further and further in order to validate these laws. But the fact that they...
Okay, y'all. So when I'm done with this, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do both today, but I want to do another live stream about judicial supremacy and judicial review, because the Supreme Court and the judiciary as a whole has actually elevated itself above the other three branches of government. So I would like to talk about that today, but I don't know how much time I'm going to have.
Are obliged to stretch the meaning is the best proof that a constitution is necessary and does work. Now, what would happen if our electorate today was more enlightened politically and philosophically? The Supreme Court would not be able to pass as constitutional the kind of decisions which they have passed. Therefore, if you observe the history of the infringement of the Constitution, you will see that the fault came from the fact that the first small, dubious infringement were accepted. If the electorate were properly enlightened, the objections would have and should have risen the first time that a blatantly unconstitutional decision was passed.
And for many people, the first major decision that violated the Constitution was Marbury versus Madison, which I'm going to hopefully address. That established the concept of judicial review. The Supreme Court can just deem any act of Congress as unconstitutional, and also acts of the state. So yeah, the Supreme Court elevated itself above all branches of government and the state. So the Supreme Court actually has more power than all three branches of government, as well as the states.
An unconstitutional law was approved.
Mr. Cuno.
Ms. Rand, why is a republic more proper than a democracy?
Well, because we have to define our concepts clearly. A democracy, in the political meaning of the word, the original meaning, defining a specific political system, means a country governed by unlimited majority rule. A democracy is a form of government in which the majority has the right to vote on anything and to pass any laws they see fit, the sole standard of legality being a majority vote, that is a counting of numbers. Democracy is incompatible with the Constitution because the principle there is that the sole standard of right or wrong in politics is a counting of noses, a majority rule. The best example of that system are the original city-states of Greece, where, if you remember, the majority had the right to vote a death sentence for a man if they disapproved of his ideas. And Socrates is the best example, the most famous one, of what is wrong with the system of democracy.
Socrates is an example, but now we have a more recent example, which is in Uganda. Uganda is supposed to be a Republican form of government, but they're actually carrying it out as a democracy. They passed this draconian homophobic law where they can round up gay people and put them to death just because they don't agree with their lifestyle. That is not how a Republican form of government is supposed to work. That is how a democracy works, where you can form factions and then disenfranchise one faction, a group against another. And the founding fathers were against democracies for this very reason. Just because you have a majority does not give you the right to infringe on the rights of minorities. And this is why it's so important for you to understand what a right is. You have the right to life, liberty, and property. And if you don't have rights, then what is your objection to laying down and being killed, right? This is some altruistic bullshit where you're sacrificing yourself to cannibals. You don't have rights. You're just supposed to live for the benefit of others. That is not a free society.
Socrates was condemned to death because the majority of the citizens found that his ideas were subversive to the use of Athens. And he refused to escape, though he had a chance. He declared that his fellow citizens were wrong in their decision, but they had the right to vote away his life, which is a ghastly example of the sanction of the victim and a perfect example of the nature of a democracy as a political system of government. Now, a republic, properly, is a system of government which is limited by the individual rights of man, which means that the majority may vote, but only in a strictly limited and defined political sphere, and that the individual rights of man are not subject to majority vote nor to government legislation.
So, under a Republican form of government, you can vote on things such as public roads or, I don't know, things like, public works or things that benefit the general will of the society. You cannot vote on things like abortion. You can't vote on gay rights. You can't vote on anything that is an individual right. Right? This is why you need to understand what a right is. Certain things cannot be put to a public vote. They belong to the individual. That's what an individual right. They do not. That's what an individual right is. Individual rights are not part of the public domain.
All that the government can and should do in regard to rights is protect them, but government cannot infringe them. That is, in essence, the nature of a proper republic.
Then would you look upon a representative democracy as curing any of the flaws of a democracy, or?
Okay, so this is kind of an oxymoron. The founding fathers did refer to America as a representative democracy because there had never been a republic, and so that was their way of describing something that didn't exist. It was just, okay, well, we have a republic, we have examples of that, but what is a republic that is representative? I mean, or a democracy that is representative. So they called it a representative democracy, but in fact, a representative democracy is an oxymoron. Democracies are pure majority will. They're not representative. They don't protect the rights of individuals.
Merely lessening them?
I would say worsening them, if anything. If by representative democracy you mean a system which is based on the democratic principle of unlimited majority rule, but merely delegates that power to the chosen representatives rather than to the direct vote of the citizens.
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yes.
No, that would be even worse, because for a large country, a majority would not be likely to agree on some vicious legislation, whereas a small chosen body of representatives, unguided and unlimited by any restricting principle, is the pattern of a tyranny. Then your representatives, in the name of the alleged majority, may be guilty of any form of violating individual rights, of establishing complete status tyranny, yet it would be consistent with your principle if the principle is unlimited majority rule.
Mr. Mussorgsky.
Ms. Rand, you have said that the government should protect the individual. Should the government protect an assemblage of individuals, such as a union?
Well, yes and no, in this sense. A union or any group of individuals cannot have any rights other than the rights of its individual members. Therefore, the government can protect a union or any other organization only from the standpoint of the individual rights of its members being infringed. If somebody attacks a union by force, then the government should protect it, but the reason why it should protect it is the individual rights of the members. If, however, you mean protecting a union as a group against its own members, that is obviously a contradiction. To protect a group as such means to enforce, to support by the force of law some actions of that group against individual members who may disagree. That, of course, is direct contradiction, and that right cannot be claimed by anyone.
And it's not just unions, it's corporations also. The government only has the authority to protect individual members. The government does not have the authority to give special protections to corporations themselves.
Mr. Finkelstein.
Yes, Ms. Rand, which rights would you say that by in taking into consideration the Constitution of the United States, which rights do the government possess over the people politically?
The government or any group, organization does not have any rights. Let's be very clear about it. Rights are a concept which pertains and can pertain only to the individual. And what is the base of rights? There is really only one right, but it is so fundamental that all other rights are merely derivatives and restatements of the same basic right. That right is the right of a man to his own life.
The one basic right that all human beings have is the right to self-ownership. Everything else is a derivative or a restatement of that basic principle. Your right to liberty and your right to property are both restatements of your right to life. And it goes even further than that. I was listening to somebody talking about the right to life, and because he was framing it as coming from God, he's saying that you don't have the right to die because that came from God. No, it didn't come from God. So I do see why people want to make that distinction. It doesn't come from God. It's a logical argument based on what your rights would be in a state of nature. So if you have the right to life, then you have the right to die. It's your life. You can do whatever you want with it.
To begin with, a right, let's define that, is a moral concept which defines and sanctions a man's freedom of action in an individual, in a social context. A right is a social moral concept. It pertains to what is right, what is good for men to do in relation to other men. On a desert island, you would still need morality, but you wouldn't need rights, because there would be no one there to infringe your freedom of action.
So y'all hear what she said? She's referring to what John Locke said. In a state of nature, before there was anyone to infringe on your survival or be a threat to your survival, that is what the state of nature is. Rights only come into play when you're interacting with others. Then it becomes a social contract that, hey, I won't violate your rights if you don't violate mine. Right? You can say that's not a valid argument, but the whole thing is that when you have a structure of government, then the government has a monopoly on the use of physical force. And so the government is authorized to use physical force to protect your rights. That is the only legitimate exercise of the government's monopoly on the use of force.
It is in the society that the question of rights arises. And the basic issue there is, does one man have the right to dispose of the life of another? The basic right that has to be respected and defined in a social context is the ownership, the property, if you will, of a man's own life. And once you have established that a man is the owner of his own life, that he has a right to live, that his life is his to dispose of and does not belong to anyone else, you have the base from which all other rights are to be derived. If a man has a right to his own life, then he has a right to take all those actions which are necessary by his nature as man, as a rational being, to sustain and protect his own life. And if it is a right, then it is equally applicable to all individuals, to all human beings. In order to prove that a certain action is in fact a right, you have to prove that it is required by man's nature. You would have to base it on the nature of man as he exists. So it is equally applicable to all other men. For the first issue to be observed very carefully in deciding what is or is not properly a right is the issue of does the claimed right apply equally to all men or not. If it does not, then it cannot be a right.
Rights are objective, not subjective. You can't have subjective rights where it only applies to one group and not the other. That's the whole notion of, that's the reason why people are getting so confused. They're saying, oh, I have a right to this, I have a right to that. No, just because you're poor, that doesn't mean that you have a right to welfare. Well, okay, not a natural right. You don't have a natural right to take someone else's property. You can have a legal right because the legal right is violating natural rights. They created these legal rights which are invalid, and they are illegitimate exercises of the government's authority. So, but you need to know the difference, because even though they're doing it, that doesn't mean that it is legitimate. So once you recognize that what they're doing is illegitimate, then you could recognize what needs to be resisted and why this illegitimate government needs to be overthrown.
For instance, an example of it. When some men today assert economic rights, so-called, when they claim that they're entitled to the unearned support of other men, when men claim that they're entitled to a minimum sustenance to be provided by others, this is obviously a denial of the concept of rights. Because in order to provide unearned sustenance to one man, you would have to exact slave labor from another man. And you cannot claim the right to infringe the rights of one man in favor of another. That is denying the concept of rights. Nothing which infringes some man's rights for the benefits of others can, in logic and in morality, be claimed to be a right. A right has to apply on equal terms. That is, as the same principle to every member of the human race.
Mr. Finkelstein.
I just wanted to know what position now the American government should take. What position now the American government should take, or any government that we're talking about, the political government that we're talking about, should take in protecting the rights of the individual.
Well, first let's define how can rights be infringed. The basic way in which one man can infringe the rights of another is by the use of physical force or compulsion. Anything which you force a man to do without his voluntary choice and consent is an infringement of his rights.
You hear that, people who want to force people to get vaccinated? You're violating their rights. You're using physical force by using the coercive power of the government to control another man's life. You are a tyrant. You are a threat to my liberty.
Therefore, what the government is required to protect men from is the use of physical violence. The government has to be an arbiter who settles disputes among men according to objective principles in order to prevent them from resorting to violence.
That is the function of courts, which hopefully I'll be able to get to today. But in the First Amendment, it says you have a right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The right to petition includes the right to file lawsuits. And the purpose of the right to petition the courts is to prevent violence. So, in a state of nature, yes, might makes right, but in a state of society, we have a government that is supposed to protect your rights in order to eliminate violence, or at least, you know, not having an actual gunfight in the middle of the street. The government is always going to be using physical force, but that is considered legitimate force if they're protecting your rights.
And in case of crime or foreign attack, it is the government's duty to protect a man from the aggressors who are using physical force against him. Now, those are the basic functions of a government and the way in which a government protects individual rights.
Thank you.
Mr. Gandolfi.
Getting back to political systems, do you feel that it's desirable for political government to be instituted as we have in this country, divided into areas, and geographic areas be given a certain minimum amount of representation in the national legislature?
Are you speaking of the issue of reapportionment?
I'm speaking of the idea of each state having 2 votes in the Senate, as opposed to a system where they'd have proportion to population.
Oh yes, that is the same issue. Yes, of course, it is absolutely essential to have local state representation as apart from individual citizens' representation. Here, the issue is one of political structure, because it is not sufficient to decide that we want a government which protects individual rights and our good intentions are sufficient. The desire to have a free country and the government of free institutions isn't sufficient. You have to know what kind of structure will carry out that idea or that intention. And the first problem in political structure is how to prevent the government from becoming tyrannical or oppressive. Since the government has a monopoly on the use of physical force, and by the nature of a government, it has to have that monopoly, since it is the protector of men against force, and the agency which uses force under laws, under strictly and objectively defined laws. A government has to be that kind of agency. Now, the problem becomes how to devise a system in which this institution that uses force cannot step out of its boundaries and become an institution of arbitrary tyranny, arbitrary whim. To do that, it is necessary to have the system of checks and balances, which was the great achievement of the founding fathers. They devised the system which could not rest merely on the good intentions or the promises of any one particular office holder. They made it impossible for any particular branch of government to usurp total power and to establish tyranny.
I guess that's true, except when it comes to the judiciary, because there are no checks on the judiciary. You can change the law by statute, but the Supreme Court can actually overrule it and say that it violates the Constitution. So the judiciary has the final say in all things. And yeah, and it changes like the wind. You get a new set of judges, and then that tips the scale in the opposite direction, and now the laws are completely different. And now all of a sudden, it changes the landscape of the entire country.
Now, when you speak of checks and balances, it is essential then to have local government which can serve as a deliberate antagonist, not an ally, but a check, meaning an antagonist on the power of the central government. And the duties of both have to be balanced.
All right, so y'all know that the states just sued the federal government because Joe Biden was trying to cancel student loans. So they were the protagonists in that example. You can choose to agree or disagree with it. Many people feel that Joe Biden shouldn't cancel student loans because it puts the burden on taxpayers. Maybe I'll address that. No, I don't have time. I do want to address it, but I don't have time, and I have so many other topics that I want to cover. So I'm probably gonna have to leave that one alone.
In such a way that each serves to prevent the other from unconstitutional usurpation of power. Now, but when you want to establish a balance of that kind, you have to consider whom or what are you balancing. After all, men live in certain localities. If you have a large country, a federal government is at a great distance from you. An individual citizen in a given area cannot exercise direct control over the federal government, and for that citizen to spread his ideas to such an extent that he would get a majority of the whole country is an impossible concept. How then can an individual citizen have a certain proper influence on the conduct of the central government? Only through a series of steps of local governments which progressively or going down are closer and closer to the influence of the immediate citizens involved. Therefore, your locality, your geographical position becomes of enormous importance. What you have to protect and bear in mind is the fact that your government has to be structured in such a manner that your local citizens exercise direct power over their local authorities. Then you rise a step higher and you have, say, county authorities, then state authorities, then regional and federal. In other words, you need a hierarchy which ultimately rests on the actual place of residence of the citizens who are going to vote and direct the course of the country. I must also remember in politics that citizens as such, men, do not represent a political unit. To have a country, you need two elements, man and geography. A country is always limited by
There's this expression in political science that all politics are local because there is no national consensus. Like every geographic location has its own needs. Some um, areas of the country are more rural, some are more urban. You know, there's a different culture between New York and California and Texas. And so, yeah, there is no national consensus on most issues.
its geographical boundaries, and the men who live in it are then its citizens. But it is not a collection of men floating in space. So that, for instance, such a phenomenon as the gypsies who travel all over the world could not be considered a nation or a country. They are individuals, but they have no geographical locations. They are nomads. Therefore, they are not yet the element of a political structure. Now, the proposal to limit all political voting districts to one man, one vote, as they call it, is in effect the attempt to destroy all political structure and to reduce the country to a nomad population ruled by one central government. It's one of the most dangerous proposals for the destruction of a political structure in this country, and it is a direct road to a democracy in the original and worst sense of the word, to unlimited majority rule and to leaving the country in the power and at the whim of any temporary majority of the moment. If, however, your purpose is to protect individual rights, you need a series of semi-sovereign states, semi-sovereign localities governed by its local population, then united into a wider entity, which is the United States.
Mr. Gandolfi.
Along this line, you would then be in favor of such a thing as the filibuster, which limits majority rule.
Well, that is a small technical question.
By the way, I'm not sure that I agree with her on this whole sovereign thing because that is a barrier to liberty in and of itself. Because a lot of times when you file lawsuits, um, they're going to claim sovereign immunity. And the only way to get through that is to sue the state actors in their official or unofficial capacity, or I'm sorry, it's called individual capacity under 42 USC 1983. And then they're still going to claim qualified immunity, but you can't sue the state directly. So the state gets to violate your rights, and then they're protected with absolute immunity. And it's difficult to even sue the state actors. So, yeah. I mean, some people would say that they don't want people to be able to sue the state because yeah, she's contradicting herself. I'm just going to go ahead and say it, because what she's saying essentially is she's making a case for state rights, or I mean, you could say it's a state duty to protect its citizens, but if it infringes on your individual rights and they can't be held accountable, then that's going to be a problem.
I'm not sure that that is the real and proper means. I would be in favor of a filibuster only on one principle, that is, that one must not gag debate or limit it in time in a parliamentary form of government. The legislators should have the time to discuss their proposed legislature. However, it is also true that a filibuster could go on forever. Now, that's a purely technical question of how do you lay down the rules of your parliament in such a way as to give ample time for debate, yet not allow it to degenerate into sheer obstruction. That is a small and not too important technical question, because what your legislators should be limited by is your constitution, not what kind of tricks you may pull on the floor of Congress to prevent or hasten the passage of a particular law. What is really important here is principles defined in the Constitution of what the Congress may or may not vote about.
Mr. Mussorgsky.
Do you think the choosing of the judiciary, the Supreme Court in this country, is the best way? Do you think that the president should choose the judiciary in this country for the highest court, or do you believe that gives the judiciary too much power and too much sway to the presidency?
Oh, that's a very difficult technical question. I would say no, in principle, not necessarily. It's not a bad system, because if you remember, the reasons for it were to make judiciary independent of the direct popular vote, independent of any shifting majority of the moment.
And that is the problem. The judiciary is too independent. They can't be held accountable. So I disagree with her on this too. And like I said, if I have time, I'm going to try to do content on that. I'm not sure that many people are going to listen to it because it's not really that interesting, but it is important.
Therefore, in principle, this was not an impractical idea. However, it is an example of why no system can survive the absence of philosophical consistency on the part of the citizens who practice it. Because observe, for instance, it used to be an unwritten law, but a proper moral check on the president's arbitrary whim, that the justices should be selected from representatives of both parties, and that they should be men who have done distinguished legal service. Now, this was not a constitutional provision, but it was a proper unwritten law. Observe in how many instances that has been discarded and broken. Progressively, the presidents have been appointing justices not by the principle of merit and not on the ground of their past distinguished service, but personal political alliances and handling it like a political reward. I think the worst appointments in this respect were Kennedy's, when he appointed young men who may be very distinguished citizens 40 years from now, but not in their 30s.
Mr. Finkelstein.
Ms. Rand, you spoke before about the fact that the Supreme Court has been unreasonably in stretching the Constitution of the United States. What limitations would you put, what extra limitations, if any, would you put on the Supreme Court now?
now it isn't the Supreme Court that you have to begin. I would put the following limitation if you want to indulge just in utopia building. But if you ask me a theoretical question, the limitation should be written in the Constitution to the following effect. Congress shall pass no law which contradicts other laws on the status and which is so unclear that no two congressmen or private lawyers can decide what it means. The present state of the Supreme Court is not entirely the Supreme Court's fault. The real trouble there is as follows. Today's congressmen, and by today I...
Well, here's the thing. When Congress passes these laws that are ambiguous and vague, instead of interpreting that law as or giving it its own meaning, the Supreme Court should just deem that provision invalid and then send it back to Congress to rewrite it. That's what they should do. But instead, they decide to expand or limit it and interpret it whatever way they decide and basically legislate from the bench. And it's not just when Congress passes laws that are vague. The Supreme Court, well, if you read the Roe v. Wade decision, I mean, they reached the right result, but they did it on the improper basis, which is why it was ultimately overturned. They basically created this right to privacy, which had existed before, but they if you read it, it's so specific. It wasn't a case or controversy that was being ruled on. They laid out rules on when you could get an abortion, and they literally legislated from the bench. And you can say that's because Congress dropped the ball, but no, it wasn't specific to that one case. So they legislated from the bench, and they could have done it on a completely different basis. What they should have done is use the Ninth Amendment, but nobody ever wants to use that because that's going to open the floodgates, and then basically all of these illegitimate acts of government can be challenged when it is pointed out that states don't have rights, and rights that were not enumerated are reserved to the people.
I mean progressively in the past decades, being at the mercy of the next election and a total political ideological chaos in the country, have been very careful to pass the kind of non-objective laws that could please, they hoped, everybody in the electorate next.
Okay, by the way, and I thought I was going to get to that other video or that live stream about the judicial supremacy, but the other thing that the judiciary has the power to do is to create rules. So there's not always a case for controversy. They create these rules out of thin air, and then these rules have the same effect as statutes. So they are literally legislating from the bench.
Times they came up for re-election. Therefore, the passage of vaguely worded, non-objective laws, the kind that won't antagonize anybody, has been a habit growing progressively more so in the past decades. When you pass non-objective laws, somebody ultimately has to decide what that law means. And therefore, Congress has been dumping on the Supreme Court the kind of laws which they didn't trouble to make clear, and the Supreme Court was in effect forced to legislate because Congress had failed to do so. There have even been in the past complaints from Supreme Court justices on just this point, that the laws they are asked to pass on are so non-objective, so vaguely worded, that they are forced to legislate in effect.
They're not forced to legislate. What they should do is deem that particular provision void for vagueness. It happens all the time. When people file lawsuits all the time challenging a statute because it's so vague that you can't determine its meaning. All laws should be written in plain language so that any man of ordinary intelligence can understand them. But as I stated before, they purposefully create these laws to be, extremely vague, and they use all these legalese because that is how they justify their profession. They're not doing anything special, but if you understood how simple their jobs are, you would not be paying them $500 an hour.
Therefore, if you wanted to correct the present situation, it would have to start with the correction of the manner in which Congress passes laws. There would have to be stricter provisions for the objectivity of the laws enacted.
I don't know if we have time to answer more than one very brief question. I'd like to ask one. I don't know if the answer can be brief, though. Who in this society do you think should determine the constitutionality of laws?
In an ideal society, it should be the job of the Supreme Court. But I think the Constitution should be a little more explicit about the field in which the government has or does not have the right to pass laws or controls.
I'm sorry, I see everybody else.
Okay, so that's what I hope to address, but I'm not feeling like I have a lot of energy to do another live stream. But the Anti-Federalist Papers, Brutus 15, he basically challenged the notion of judicial supremacy and judicial review, and that the Supreme Court should not have the final say. So I hope to get to that at some point. I'm not sure that I'll be able to get to it today.